Come along on my creative journey in designing and fashioning a new Florentine Renaissance gown known as a gamurra. Accompany me through all of the sometimes frustrating stages, from conception and patterning through to construction and finishing. There will be plenty of lessons learned and cheeky commentary along the way. On our last spine-tingling episode, we explored the history of the gamurra and the extant garments that help us understand it as a real piece of clothing. We chose our fabrics and delved into the logic behind those choices, and traversed the rough waters of design, patterning, and layout. And finally, we executed the scariest act a tailor can. We put scissors to fabric and cut everything out in preparation for assembly. And now, our adventure of historical recreation continues. Let the assembling and minced meat fingers commence. I am starting with the bodice. First, I have to decide whether to use the lining to finish all of the opening edges, meaning the arm's eye and the neckline, or whether I'm going to use a different method. Well, 2 decades of having worn these gowns has taught me that I wear out the neckline and the arm's eye pretty badly. Thus, I'm going to use strips of the shell fabric to bind all the opening edges of the bodice. So that means that my first step will be to align the layers of each of the 4 sections of the bodice and baste them together to create 4 3-layer components. This step is essential to ensuring that the various layers play well together and act like one thick layer of fabric rather than having a mind of their own. Now, basting basically acts like a sort of thread glue. Of course, when basting layers of fabric together, it is super important to lay it all out carefully and first ensure that no layers are stretching along the bias. So I then pin the layers together, double checking that there are no bulges in any particular direction. At this point, I'm on my Korean Air flight to the US, so I shall be stitching while flying on a 15-hour flight. Turbulence gives sewing a certain 4th dimension it really should not have. Sitting in my spacious seat, I use a long-running stitch to glue the layers of each bodice piece together along all of the edges. Now, ideally, you will want to baste in such a way that your basting thread can be easily removed and recycled. Now that all the layers are basted, we can proceed to the next step. Honestly, I should have started by finishing the edges of the front opening of the bodice to protect those edges. Also, that would have meant less bulk to manipulate as I sew along, but in my rush to start assembling, I instead just commenced by attaching a front panel to a back panel at the side seam. It's not fatal, but it's annoying. Anyway, I use a tight back stitch for all of the interior seams of the bodice, which is what is used in Osana's bodice. FYI, I'm using silk thread at this point, which I am of course waxing with beeswax. Tip: when hand sewing, remember that you always want to wax your thread. It helps prevent fraying, which happens because the thread drags in and out and in and out and in and out of the fabric as you sew along. And of course, when you're machine sewing, this doesn't happen because the thread only gets pulled out as it's needed, not repeatedly. So the wax prevents the fraying, and it also tends to reduce the frequency with which your thread engages in cheeky acts of rebellion, such as knotting. Anywho, at this point, I've reached Penzik with 3 bodice panels attached, and I'm hoping to turbo finish this gamurra. But then, as I unpack, I discover that nearly all of my smocks are literally disintegrating and need to be reconstructed and patched if I am to actually have sufficient underthings to wear through 2 weeks of living medievally in a pavilion in the humid heat of August in Western Pennsylvania. So what this means practically, it leaves me with only a little bit of time to actually work on the gamurra at Penzik itself. I do manage to finish all of the needful repairs to my extant clothing, so that's good. But I don't even come close to finishing this gown at Penzik. All I get done is one of the front edges, which means I am now on my return flight from Atlanta to Seoul, which will take 15 hours, thanks to Russia being a total twat. And that leaves me with plenty of time to sew. Next up, I decide to work on the sleeves, which I am finishing by turning all of the edges in and stab stitching. Now, finishing the sleeves this way will allow me a certain flexibility in the choice of the pattern that I ultimately choose for the lace closures of my sleeves. Well, I made a pretty cardinal mistake when I was making the sleeve. I didn't line up the edges of the top half
to actually make sure that both sides align. And so now I've ended up with like an extra, God, I don't know, almost ½ inch on the one side versus the other. And while they don't have to match up perfectly, a ½ inch too long on one edge is just too much. So I've made a mark, and I've had to cut off my beautiful perfect stitching and redo it. It's so frustrating to have to redo things, but honestly, it's been so long since I've made these kind of sleeves or a gamurra at all that I'm basically reinventing the wheel. Yeah, like I said, 7 years. Well, onward with in-flight sewing.
So, I fold the tip of the sleeve back in, pin it, and start to re-sew it shut with a stab stitch. But before completing it, I decide to double check that it is the proper length. Learning from history and all that. About a ½ centimeter too long. So I tuck it in further and then proceed to stab stitch it shut. At this point, I run out of my white silk thread, or rather, it is vanished into the bag of holding that is my sewing bag. So I have switched to white linen thread that I purchased in the marketplace at Penzik. Although silk might be more suitable for a lady of my station, both extant garments and documentary evidence such as purchase records and household accounts do attest to the use of linen as joining thread even in an upper class setting. Oh, and also, we know that wax was used for sewing because extant textiles sometimes still have traces left on the sewing threads.
So to finish the edges of the bodice, I've done a facing that you can see on garments, sometimes in paintings, and actually in the Beato Sana's edging, she has a facing as well. At least it looks like a facing. It might be the edge turned back. Either way, it's a facing in the same fabric as the shell, and I've done that here. I actually did it by folding the edges in on both sides, and I've done a stab stitch along this edge and a blind stitch along this edge because this is going to take a lot of wear and tear, and I want it to last a long time, so I want to hide as much of the stitching as possible so the thread doesn't wear away, hence the blind stitch here. This really makes a super strong edge. People ask, well, do you need to bone this? Do you need to stiffen it in some way? Well, just an interlining and an edging, and I have a pretty stiff, soft edge, shall we say. It will definitely hold its own, I'm pretty certain. Basically, we're going to be finishing the inside by cutting off the excess lining and interlining along the seam on the inside, and then folding the shell fabric over top of that and finishing that off with some blind stitches to create a really strong seam that's going to stiffen the bodice along the sides. So it kind of acts as a form of soft boning to help the bodice keep its shape, even under the duress under which I put my clothing. Also, when you're sewing super thick fabric like this, I've got 6 layers I'm sewing through, 4 of which are super thick, the inner lining linen and the wool. It is so very hard to keep your stitches straight and to make them come through evenly on both sides. On one side it looks like it's super straight, and then you look at the back, you're like, holy cow, that is wonky as hell. Thankfully, the bodice is really forgiving with that kind of thickness. When you open it up, you don't see the lumpiness of the one side at all. So, the magic of fabric, what can I say? Did I mention how fun trimming seam allowances on a plane with turbulence at 35,000 feet can be? Yeah. Let's see how much more adventuresome I can make this sewing project. #Contessa silliness.
Well, that silliness includes spilling whiskey from a cocktail I did not order onto the pristine sleeves. But, as you see, wool does its job and repels the assault of the distilled bog body juice. Yes, while we finish these bodice seams using a blind stitch, let's talk about this garment a bit more. In my quest to understand historic garments, I have trawled the depths of several household inventories taken at the time of various individuals' deaths, among them the intimidating inventory of the Medici Palazzo at the time of Lorenzo il Magnifico's demise in 1492. Aside from noting that the Medici were glamorous hoarders, I also remarked that the ladies of the household seemed to have few gamurre, but rather more cotte, In fact, I have only found 4 gamurre in the whole collection. 1 gamurra of gray mixed Flemish cloth with sleeves of black satin, 1 gamurra of tawny fabric without sleeves, a pink gamurra without sleeves, and a gamurra of mixed cloth belonging to Contessina. By contrast, the inventory contains a prodigious 27 cotte, all of which consist of amazingly luxurious fabrics such as velvet, brocade, and damask, conspicuous consumption at its best. So, it seems that, at least amongst the great and the good of Florence, elaborate cotte were more common than the more practical gamurre. But of course, this could be attributed to the term gamurre being a Florentine turn of phrase for a specific kind of gown. For instance, the inventory of Alessandro Ottone, Lord of Matelica, and his wife Violante Malatesta, taken in 1487, shows that Violante had 2 gamurre, one of crimson velvet and one of black figured velvet, which is a sharp contrast to the simpler fabrics of their Florentine brethren. In fact, Florentine statutes were rife with sumptuary regulations aimed at curtailing the grotesque excesses of fashion that growing wealth was spawning. So perhaps this had something to do with the distinction in Florentine nomenclature. Of course, we all know that while the patricians of Florence pretended to a middle-class simplicity that mirrored the values of the so-called Republic, in practice they were all attempting to flaunt their wealth and display familial onore and power in much the same way as the nearby courts of Milano, Ferrara, and Urbino sought to do. And many families were happy to pay the fines and flaunt their finery, making these fines more of a participation tax than a deterrent. Another fun bit of trivia: gamurre and cotte in Florence were so valuable that they were often used as surety for loans and were often confiscated by legitimate banks and less legitimate loan sharks in compensation for unpaid debts. The records of such financial institutions can therefore often provide interesting details about clothing, as every aspect of a garment was noted in detail in order to ascertain its potential resale value. Well, we are now past Penzig, and I have still not finished this gown. As I land at Incheon, I have resolved to finish it in time for my upcoming trip to Florence. What better place to debut the gown than its native city? And I have 2 whole months, so it should be a piece of cake to get it done in time. So, fast forward to October, and I am now on my way from Seoul to Florence on an epic 48-hour itinerary via Doha, Madrid, and Venice. And no, as much as this may shock you, dear viewer, the Gamurra is not yet done. In fact, not a bit more done from where we left off. So on board my Qatar Airways flight, nestled into my Q-Suite business class seat, let us continue with the bodice, specifically the shoulder seam. Now, I have decided to finish the shoulders separately before sewing them together. At this point, I'm treating the blue and white linen as one layer of fabric and the pink wool as another. I first fold the linen layers inward, pinning down the fold, and then fold the wool to match and pin it to the linen layers. Next, I baste the pinned shoulder joint and whip stitch it together with the white linen thread. Because I whip stitch it inside out, the stitches will hardly show on the outside, so the white thread is not an issue. While we stitch, though, I thought I would mention an interesting tidbit I recently learned about dyed linen fabric. Apparently, Milano was a big center of production for colored linen in this era, which was often employed for wall hangings, canopies, and curtains. So, more than just thread. Well, we are landing in Madrid en route to Venice, so we shall see you next time in Florence to continue and hopefully finish this project, which has gone from being 2 weeks long to 3 months. Whee! Until next time, stay creative and stay tuned for your moment of Kitty Zen.